This presentation is an analysis of Lord Alfred Tennyson's poems Charge of the Light Brigade and Crossing the Bar. Summary of Charge of the Light Brigade. The poem tells the story of a brigade consisting of 600 soldiers who rode on horseback into the Valley of Death for half a league, which is about 1.5 miles. They were obeying a command to charge the enemy forces that had been seizing their guns. Not a single soldier was discouraged or distressed by the command to charge forward, even though all the soldiers realized that their commander had made a terrible mistake, shown by the line, "Someone had blundered." The role of the soldier is to obey and not to make reply, not to reason why. So they followed orders and rode into the Valley of Death. The 600 soldiers were assaulted by the shots of shells of cannons in front of and on both sides of them. Still, they rode courageously forward toward their own deaths, as shown in the lines, "Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. The soldiers struck the enemy gunners with just their swords, called sabers bare in the poem, and charged the enemy army. They rode into the artillery smoke and broke through the enemy line, destroying their Cossack and Russian opponents. Cannons behind and on both sides of the soldiers now assaulted them with shots and shells. As the brigade rode back from the mouth of hell, soldiers and horses collapsed. Few remained to make the journey back. The world marveled at the courage of the soldiers and their undying glory. The poem states, "These noble 600 soldiers remain worthy of honor and tribute today." Analysis of the Charge of the Light Brigade. The Charge of the Light Brigade is about a disastrous military engagement that took place during the beginning of the Crimean War, fought between Turkey and Russia from 1854 to 1856. The British forces entered the war in September of 1854 to prevent the Russians from obtaining control of important sea routes. From the beginning, the war was plagued by a series of misunderstandings and tactile blunders, one of which serves as the subject for this poem, when on October 25, 1854, as the Russians were seizing guns from British soldiers, and the British sent desperate orders to their light cavalry brigade to fend off the Russians. Tragically, the brigade began charging as ordered, but in the wrong direction. Over 650 men rushed forward, and well over 100 died within the next few minutes. In the 21st century, the British involvement in the Crimean War is dismissed as an instance of military incompetence. Today, we remember it only for the heroism displayed by Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse. However, for Tennyson and most of his contemporaries, the war seemed necessary and just. He wrote this poem as a celebration of the heroic soldiers in the Light Brigade who fell in service to their commander and their cause. The poem glorifies war and courage, even in cases of complete inefficiency and waste. However, today, many contemporary audiences see the poem as ironic in its justification of war at the expense of its soldiers for no good reason. For example, these famous lines were typically read during the Victorian age as sincere praise to the soldier for doing as told by his commander, regardless of the outcome. But today, people are more critical of incompetence on the part of commanders in war and read this justification of war at the expense of soldiers as ironic. Someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die, into the Valley of Death. During the Victorian age, people valued duty to country and admired the sacrifice that the soldiers made by doing as told by their commander, even if this was done for no military gain and at the expense of many soldiers' lives. Form of Charge of the Light Brigade. This poem is comprised of 6 stanzas varying in length from 6 to 12 lines. Each line is in dimeter, which means it has 2 stressed syllables, and each stressed syllable is followed by 2 unstressed syllables, making the rhythm dactylic. The use of this form is called falling rhythm. and means the stress is on the first beat of each metrical unit and then falls off for the rest of the line of the meter. This is an appropriate form since the poem is about the devastating fall of the British Brigade in this battle. The rhyme scheme varies with each stanza. Often Tennyson uses the same rhyme and occasionally even the same final word for several consecutive lines. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there. The poem also makes use of anaphora, in which the same word is repeated at the beginning of several consecutive lines. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. Here the method creates a sense of unrelenting assault. The repetition of the word cannon parallels how the soldiers must have felt the cannons firing relentlessly at them. Summary of Crossing the Bar. The speaker begins by describing the setting of the sun and the rise of the evening star, perhaps making a metaphor of death being like nighttime, and hears that he is being called, probably by death. He hopes that the ocean will not make the mournful sound of waves beating against a sandbar when he sets out to sea. Rather, he wishes for a tide that is so high that it makes no sound or foam, and therefore seems asleep when he is carried from shore out to the depths of the ocean, a metaphor for death. Perhaps this means he hopes for a peaceful death, as in quiet, for both himself and those who love him. The speaker announces the close of the day and the evening bell, which will be followed by darkness or death. He hopes that no one will cry when he departs because, although he may be carried beyond the limits of time and space as we know them in death, he maintains hope that he will look upon the face of his pilot, or God, when he has crossed the sandbar, passing from life to death. Analysis of Crossing the Bar. Tennyson wrote Crossing the Bar in 1889, 3 years before he died. The poem describes his accepting attitude towards death, which is calling him in the poem, and his Christian beliefs in life after death. Although he wrote more poetry after writing this poem, he requested that Crossing the Bar appear as the final poem in all collections of his work. Tennyson uses the metaphor of a sandbar to describe the barrier between life and death. A sandbar is a ridge of sand built up by currents along a shore. In order to reach the shore, the waves must crash against the sandbar, creating a sound that Tennyson describes as the moaning of the bar. Another important image in the poem is one of crossing, suggesting traditional Christian views of death, such as crossing referring to both crossing over into the next world, with going out to sea being a metaphor for moving from life on shore to death at sea. It also alludes to the act of crossing oneself, as in making the sign of the cross. The cross was also where Jesus died, and now, as Tennyson himself dies, he evokes the image again, suggesting life after death, as Christians believe occurs. The poem reveals his Christian hope that he will see his pilot face to face, with God being the pilot. Form of Crossing the Bar. This poem consists of 4 quatrains, or 4-line stanzas, which have the A-B rhyme scheme, meaning every other line rhymes. The first and third lines of each stanza are always a couple of beats longer than the second and fourth lines, although the line lengths vary among the stanzas.